And I'll just briefly summarize the essay before it. So essay 222, the one before it, is called Pluralist Thought. And there, Peter talks about humanists, theists, Protestants, and Catholics, and talks about their differences briefly, but also believes that essentially they all have a belief in the human personality, as he calls it, which it's not really a word we use today, or at least not the way that they used it. I think it's maybe more human personality, a belief in that is like a belief in human dignity.
That's how I read it as well. The value of a human person kind of thing.
Yeah, so I think they talk about belief in the human personality, but I think they wanted to talk about, their whole life, what their physical and spiritual, time for learning, rest. Like it was a way of it was their word for human dignity, which kind of enveloped everything during that time. So that's kind of the prequel essay because they go together. And so the essay starts here at the top of the page, 223, Pluralist State. So the belief in the human personality is the common belief of humanists, theists, Protestants, and Catholics. On this common belief of human personality, humanists, theists, Protestants, Catholics could very well build up a pluralist state. Futilitarian states, as well as totalitarian states, are not based on the cultural tradition of the Western world. The pluralist state is a state where humanists try to be human, Orthodox Jews try to be Jews, Christian Protestants try to be Christians, and Catholics try to be Catholics. So why did I choose this essay? Part of it is, I think there's this thought that, the original vision of the Catholic worker during the 30s is everyone becomes Catholic, or we all go back to the land. But, because Peter's program on the land included prayer and mass, it's hard. Sometimes, you do see that part of Dorothy and Peter's vision, but then there's these, which like this essay, The Pluralist State, it's not in most previously published editions. So if you're just reading most previous editions of Peter's essays, you'd miss this one. Someone else didn't think it was important enough to include, but I think it does kind of temper the vision. They don't, even though Peter definitely had kind of an evangelist side, I mean, he did preach Catholicism, and I think both he and Dorothy hoped that it would lead to less people leaving the Catholic Church, more people coming into the Catholic Church. But I think this essay makes clear they don't view the future world as one where we're just a Catholic society. As much as Peter promotes the Middle Ages, where it was mainly a Catholic society, he knows that to go back to that, if we wanted to go back to at least to some of the best of the Middle Ages, it wouldn't be Middle Ages where everyone is the same religion. The other reason I picked it, because I wanted to connect it to, there's this book, Peter Maurin, Apostle to the World, so which includes Dorothy Days and Francis S. I always mispronounce his name, so I'll not pronounce it. But they each have their biographies of Peter in this book. And so when Dorothy she tells the story of when they were going out to eat, and Peter started talking about what would become this essay. And so she's quoting Peter while they're either having soup or waiting for soup. But we have to go further but we have got to further the idea of personalist pluralism. The word democracy has been overworked. Personalist pluralism is difficult, but there is nothing else to express the idea. There is an entire chapter in Maritain's True Humanism on pluralism, and there is a definition of personalist democracy, which is quite different from the majority rule idea. So I guess that's the other thing, that at least the first time someone reads this essay, The Pluralist State, I mean, Peter actually uses the word state. And I think most of us assume Peter was an anarchist. Was he a strict anarchist? I don't know. He never uses the term. Dorothy states that he was. Did he shy away from the term because he knew it would turn people off? Perhaps. But, you know, in State here, he's very clear, at least in Dorothy's remembrance of their conversation, that his vision of this pluralist state isn't majority rule. You know, and this did make me then go and read Maritain's book, True Humanism, from the 30s. And because this essay doesn't really get into the specifics. Peter liked to bring what he thought were important ideas, but as he liked to say, he didn't like to give detailed blueprints because he knew things could change depending on the situation, and he didn't want to restrict people. But in Maritain's book from this time period, he kind of views what would be termed his ideal state as representatives from different groups. So if in your area, there were some Catholics and there were some humanists and there was just throw together all the groups, how you decide which group deserves to have a representative, or what if certain people are part of multiple groups. And they don't get into all the specifics of that, but it was something where instead of just majority rules, they wanted to make sure every group was represented and had a dialogue with working out how to best live in society with one another. You know, for some folks, that might be representative of how certain anarchist societies could come about.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like a, you know, confederation, or they would use, anarchists would probably use a different word, but it does not sound contradictory there. And this, I was glad to reread this Pluralist State one, because it does kind of address a little bit of, we were just talking about the canon laws, the law of the land line, and was that number 2, essay 2, where, so he does kind of, he says that, but at the same time, one, Peter's not really one to like impose things by force. It doesn't seem like he's saying we should have Catholic police that like go around and enforce religious law, which is, there are people kind of like that in our contemporary society, and if they had their way, they would have a theocracy or something like that. And so that's kind of where I, you know, like we were saying before, being cautious about quoting Peter saying we need the canon law to be the law of the land. And so, yeah, so here he is very explicitly saying, like, yeah, but we don't, not everyone has to be Catholics. In fact, it'd be better, he says specifically elsewhere, to variety of effect, like, let's keep the Jews Jewish for, you know, Christ's sake, I believe he says, right?
Yeah. Yeah, there, you know, there have been a couple times talking about previous essays, I almost brought this up. Maybe this is appropriate here, or maybe it's just a complete sidebar, but there was an essay written by Jack Lee Downey recently. He's not a Catholic worker, but he wrote a book called Bread for the Strong, which was about the Dorothy's Beloved Retreat.
Okay.
But he also wrote an article recently about Dorothy's FBI file, and which I have not gone through, but he pulled out kind of what stuck out to him. And one of those was that Dorothy was like the main people that reported Dorothy to the FBI after the FBI was founded were Catholics. They read this newspaper and they're like, what is going on? And so there were bishops, there were priests, there were seminarians, and they're writing to Hoover, who's not Catholic. But the way that they write to him, as he pointed out, they write like almost like they're good friends, or they're entrusting this person, because they want to save their church from the likes of Peter and Dorothy. And so when Peter is asking for Catholics to try to be the best Catholics, I don't think he's alluding to those Catholics who are corroborators with the state to try to get Dorothy. Well, in this case, with the beginning of Dorothy Day's file, probably because the internet didn't exist and it's harder to track down birth certificates and all that, the FBI file is speculating that Dorothy might not even be American. She might be a plant from Moscow. She might actually be Russian. But anyway, I feel like maybe that's a total aside, but just speaking of, who these Catholics are and what they envisioned is the best version of Catholicism, I don't think was the social encyclicals that Peter and Dorothy are promoting.
Yeah. Well, and one of my thoughts reading this too, and this is maybe taking that same thought, but applying it to all the groups listed. In the previous essay, it feels like he almost builds these ideologies, philosophies on top of each other. He talks about the humanists believe in humanity or whatever he says, or believe a man is a man for all of that. And then the theists believe that, but they also believe God created the world. Protestants believe God created the world, but also Jesus and stuff like that. And so then he goes on in this essay to say the common belief of the human personality of all these groups was what will build the pluralist state. And I would propose perhaps that the problem with that is, I don't know that any of these groups are respect the human personality in our society. None of those groups contain humanism. I guess I always come back to this, but I don't think I'm ever wrong. It's under capitalism, it's a consumer society. It is not a humanist society. It is a society where consumption is the driving force. So the hope of building Peter's pluralist society currently feels very far off when there is little value to human lives. And right now, of course, or in the past couple of years, we've had this pandemic, right? And human life has not been valued very highly. You got to get back to work because the economy might die. And if a few thousand people a day have to literally die to prevent that, that's just the math, at least as far as the system goes. And there's not a small number of people who are okay with that math, or at least apathetic enough to go along with it, or resigned enough, perhaps, to carrots and sticks, depending on where you are in the social structure. But yeah, the Catholics, the humanists, the Christians, the theists, unfortunately, too many of them don't have the foundation of humanism even to build on.
Yeah, and that might be, or if Peter was here, I think he might be saying, well, they're not taking the best of their religious tradition. They might, those Catholics who are reporting Dorothy, they might believe that they're purporting the best of Catholicism, but it seems like maybe they have been thoroughly Americanized and capitalized. And that's definitely invading the best of Catholicism. And I think that's one thing they're trying to write about, but they're always walking that fine line between, about to not critique too much those Catholics who think that way. Maybe because there's too many bishops that think that way. I'm not sure. The other thing, though, that as what you said reminded me of, in line 3, where he's talking about totalitarian states, he says totalitarian states are not based on the cultural tradition of the Western world. I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, did you read, like Peter, I'm pretty sure you know about Plato's Republic with the philosopher king and a totalitarian state where, at least if the totalitarian is a great person and very wise, everything will work out. I think that is the reason that people have fallen prey to the idea of a totalitarian society is they're like, well, maybe this isn't the ideal, but at least everything will be the way it's supposed to be and forced from the outside. I do think Peter's maybe clouding the notion of the best of the Catholic religious tradition and the Western tradition. And I could see someone rightly making an argument, well, can you separate the two? I guess ideally the Catholic in me wants to say you can separate the two, but it is a tradition that's definitely intertwined.
Yeah. That line struck me as well going through it. And that is one of the couple biggest critiques or blind spots of Peter's thought, is like the Eurocentrism kind of thing. And what year did this one come out? Let me look here. 30. This is only 36. I was reading a critique recently of like the response to the war in Ukraine as opposed to other wars, and folks being like, without not necessarily using this exact language, but like, this is Europe. This isn't one of those countries that's always at war, and they don't say it, but like brown people are always killing each other and they're used to that kind of barbarism. Europe, this is different because it's Europe. And this author was like, y'all know the Holocaust happened in Europe, right? Like the greatest systematized genocide in history is the tradition of Europe, And so, yeah, going back to that, like, totalitarianism is not in the Western tradition. It's like, it seems like it perhaps is exemplified in the Western tradition, not that it can't exist elsewhere,
Yeah, but you reminded me when you said what year was this published, and we both looked and saw 1936. I think to me, this also shows a lot of the evolution of Peter's thought, or at least growth of Peter's thought, happens as he's reading books, which he's just constantly reading books. And Maritain's book, Integral Humanism, was published in 1936. So you often see that what the essays he's publishing are often bringing in some book or new insight that he just had. So it's like, this would be a clear example. Like, this essay wouldn't exist if Maritain hadn't published Integral Humanism that year.
Mm-hmm. That can be a dangerous game sometimes. I mean, to be so excited about a new thought. I should keep that in mind for myself, probably. But yeah, we have it here from Peter.
And I'll just throw in we were talking about this before we started recording, but if anyone did decide they wanted to check out Maritain and they're like, oh, Peter likes some of Maritain's ideas on, the state and how to organize society, like, this is Maritain from the 30s. Peter dies in 49. And then Maritain writes some of his more famous works in the 50s, where he definitely moves to more of a nation state mentality, especially post World War II. So, you know, Peter would have had many more, Peter probably wouldn't have been quoting his works post World War II, but during the 30s, Peter was definitely enamored with Jacques Maritain.
Yeah. Yeah, and he does that with plenty of thinkers, right? Like he wouldn't quote everything Lenin says, but he, you know, would quote the no revolution without a theory of revolution, right?
Yeah, but I think with Jacques Maritain, it was, I think he largely agreed during the 30s, with Jacques Maritain of the 30s, I think he largely agreed with everything he wrote. So it wasn't like he was, you know, it wasn't like with Lenin where he's picking and choosing a couple lines to kind of try to shock people into thinking.
Yeah.
Here, I think he's actually interested in all of Maritain's thought, and it's obvious that he reads everything that Maritain published. And when Maritain visited the Catholic Worker, I mean, you know, he was very excited for that to happen. This is a hero of his.
That's funny. I'm trying to think of what thinker, if they visited my Catholic Worker, I'd just be so excited. And I think the anarchist in me would be just too cool to be excited.